The child was only 19 months old when it happened. She had been vibrant, filled with life, and growing faster than her parents could keep up with. There were whispers of brilliance in her early babbling, a spark of intelligence that her family admired, even if it was the hopeful optimism of new parents. But in February of 1882, something terrible happened to young Helen. A sudden illness, which doctors called acute congestion of the stomach and brain, swept over her like a storm. Within a few days, Helen Keller, once full of light and sound, plunged into a world of complete darkness and silence. Her parents, Arthur and Kate Keller, were devastated. They were not just losing their child to illness, they were watching her fall into a permanent void of unknowing isolation. As Helen recovered physically, it became clear that she could no longer hear their voices. Her eyes no longer followed the light. The doctors gave them little hope. Their precious daughter would be blind and deaf for the rest of her life. What followed were years of frustration, confusion, and a deepening sense of helplessness for Helen and her family. As the toddler grew into a small child, her inability to communicate led to intense frustration, expressed in frequent tantrums and fits of anger. She lived in a silent world, cut off from the most basic forms of human interaction. But despite the barriers, Helen's spirit remained undiminished. Deep inside, the girl knew there was more to life than the dark and silent cage in which she was trapped. It was this fierce inner will, combined with the arrival of an extraordinary teacher, that would unlock the world for her, propelling Helen Keller to become one of the most influential figures of the 20th century. This is the story of her journey from darkness into light. Born on June 27, 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama, Helen Adams Keller came into the world as a healthy child. Her father, Arthur Keller, was a former Confederate officer and a newspaper editor, while her mother, Kate Adams Keller, was from a well-established family. The Kellers were not wealthy, but they were comfortably middle class, living on a modest homestead called Ivy Green. They were proud of their baby girl, whom they adored. For the first 19 months of her life, Helen was like any other child. She played, laughed, and absorbed the world around her. She had begun to speak her first few words, a joyful milestone that filled her parents with pride. However, the joy was short-lived. In February 1882, Helen fell gravely ill. Doctors now believe it was likely scarlet fever or meningitis, though the exact illness was never determined. For days, the Keller household was filled with dread as Helen's fever raged. When the fever finally subsided, relief turned to despair. Helen's parents noticed that she no longer responded to sounds. Her once bright eyes seemed to have lost their focus. The illness had stolen her ability to hear and see, plunging her into an existence where both senses were absent. At first, Helen's parents were in denial. They clung to the hope that her sight or hearing might return, but as weeks turned into months, the truth settled in. Helen was permanently blind and deaf. The world around her, once so vibrant, was now inaccessible. She could not understand the words spoken to her, nor could she see the faces of those who loved her. Her existence became one of confusion, frustration, and isolation. As Helen grew older, her inability to communicate became more pronounced. She was trapped inside her own body, unable to express her needs or desires in ways that others could understand. She could feel the vibrations of footsteps on the floor and the touch of her family's hands, but without language or sight, she had no way to connect with the world. Desperate to make herself understood, Helen resorted to gestures, and when those failed, to physical outbursts. By the time she was 5, Helen's frustration had grown into uncontrollable fits of anger. She would kick and scream, throw objects, and lash out at anyone who tried to calm her. She wanted to communicate, to interact with the world, but she did not know how. Her parents, though loving, were overwhelmed by the magnitude of her condition and were unsure of how to help her. They tried to accommodate her needs as best as they could, but they lacked the tools and knowledge necessary to teach a child who could neither see nor hear. Despite these challenges, Helen showed signs of remarkable intelligence. She had developed a few rudimentary signs to indicate her desires. A shake of her head meant no, a nod meant yes. She also imitated household activities, demonstrating that she was observing and learning in her own way. However, without a structured means of communication, these gestures were limited and her frustration continued to mount. Helen's parents were determined to find a way to help their daughter. They sought advice from doctors and specialists, but most had little hope to offer. In desperation, they contacted Dr. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, who had a long-standing interest in working with the deaf. Bell recommended that they contact the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, a school known for its innovative approaches to educating children with disabilities. It was through this connection that Anne Sullivan entered Helen's life in 1887, a pivotal moment that would change everything. Anne Sullivan was no stranger to hardship. Born in 1866 to Irish immigrant parents, she had faced immense challenges from a young age. Her family was impoverished, and Anne contracted trachoma as a child, a bacterial infection that left her nearly blind. By the time she was 8, her mother had died, and her father abandoned the family. Anne and her brother Jimmy were sent to the Tewkesbury Almshouse, a grim institution for the poor. The conditions at Tewkesbury were brutal, and Anne suffered greatly during her time there. Her brother died shortly after their arrival, leaving her alone in a harsh and unforgiving environment. Despite the adversity, Anne was determined to improve her situation. At the age of 14, she persuaded officials to allow her to attend the Perkins Institute for the Blind, where she received an education and eventually underwent surgery to restore some of her vision. Anne's experiences at Perkins shaped her profoundly. She understood the challenges faced by individuals with disabilities, and she developed a deep sense of empathy for those who were marginalized by society. She also honed her skills as a teacher, learning innovative methods for educating children with visual impairments. When the opportunity arose to work with Helen Keller, Anne was eager to take on the challenge. Anne arrived at the Keller household in March 1887, and her first meeting with Helen was far from easy. Helen, used to having her own way and acting out her frustrations through physical outbursts, initially resisted Anne's attempts to discipline her. Anne quickly realized that in order to teach Helen, she needed to establish boundaries and build trust. She began by insisting that Helen eat with a spoon rather than her hands, a small but important step in teaching her self-control and discipline. The real breakthrough came a few weeks later on April 5, 1887, at a water pump outside the Keller home. Anne had been trying to teach Helen the concept of language by spelling words into her hand, but Helen had not yet made the connection between the letters and the objects they represented. On this particular day, Anne led Helen to the pump, where she placed one of Helen's hands under the running water while spelling the word W-A-T-E-R into the other hand. Something extraordinary happened in that moment. Helen suddenly understood that the cool liquid flowing over her hand had a name, and that the letters Anne was spelling corresponded to that name. It was as though a door had been opened, and Helen's mind was flooded with the realization that everything in the world had a name that could be communicated through touch. Overwhelmed with excitement, Helen demanded to know the names of everything around her. She touched the ground, and Anne spelled earth into her hand. She touched the flowers, the trees, and the sky, eager to learn the words that would allow her to connect with the world around her. That day marked the beginning of Helen's journey into language and communication. Chapter 3. Learning to communicate. Helen Keller's life changed dramatically after that breakthrough moment at the water pump. What followed was a period of intense and exhilarating learning, as Helen eagerly absorbed as much information as she could. The world, which had been so small and confined, suddenly expanded before her, offering new and exciting possibilities. Anne Sullivan became her constant guide, patiently teaching her the names of everything she encountered, not only through the manual alphabet, but also through experiences that connected abstract concepts with tangible sensations. One of the key challenges Anne faced was teaching Helen how to communicate more complex ideas. Helen's hunger for knowledge was insatiable, but conveying abstract ideas, such as emotions, time, and ideas like love or justice, was far more difficult than teaching her simple nouns like water or doll. Anne devised innovative ways to make these abstract concepts more tangible to Helen. For instance, when teaching the word love, Helen was initially confused. She could not understand how something she could not touch or see could have a name. To help Helen grasp the concept, Anne tried to explain love as something that could not be seen but was felt deeply in the heart. She would press Helen's hand against her own chest, allowing her to feel the heartbeat as she spelled the word L-O-V-E. Slowly, Helen began to comprehend the idea that some things exist beyond the physical senses, but can still be experienced deeply. Helen's learning didn't stop at words and ideas. Soon after she learned the manual alphabet, Anne began teaching her how to read Braille. The tactile system of raised dots provided Helen with another means of accessing the written word, and her thirst for books became evident. She devoured books in Braille, from simple stories to more complex texts, always seeking to expand her understanding of the world. The tactile nature of Braille connected Helen with the great works of literature and history, allowing her to experience the thoughts and ideas of others in a way that felt almost magical to her. In the Keller household, life also began to change. Where there had once been confusion, frustration, and despair, there was now hope and optimism. Helen's family marveled at her transformation. Arthur Keller, her father, was particularly astonished by how quickly his daughter learned and how eager she was to engage with the world. Her mother, Kate, who had always held on to hope, found joy in watching her daughter's remarkable progress. The once out-of-control child, who had been prone to violent tantrums, was now a calm and inquisitive student, eager to learn and communicate. Still, the road was not always smooth. Helen faced moments of deep frustration when she encountered new challenges, and Anne had to constantly find ways to keep Helen motivated. Anne herself was often exhausted, as teaching Helen required not only intellectual effort but also tremendous emotional and physical energy. Yet Anne's devotion to Helen never wavered. She knew that the breakthrough at the water pump was just the beginning and that there were still many obstacles Helen would need to overcome. As Helen grew older, her intellectual capacities continued to develop at an astonishing rate. Anne encouraged her to think critically about the world around her, asking her to question, explore, and reflect on the lessons she was learning. Helen's mind, sharp and hungry for more knowledge, began to understand the complexities of life, society, and human behavior. By the time she was 10, Helen was communicating fluently using the manual alphabet, reading Braille with ease, and even learning how to write using a special typewriter for the blind. Despite these achievements, Helen's world was still largely limited to her home and her immediate surroundings. Though she was learning at an impressive pace, she had little opportunity to interact with others beyond her family and Anne. This changed when Anne took Helen on a trip to Boston, where she introduced her to the Perkins Institute for the Blind, the very school where Anne had once been a student. The trip was a revelation for Helen, as it allowed her to meet other children with disabilities who, like her, were learning to communicate and engage with the world in new ways. At Perkins, Helen formed her first friendships outside of her family. These connections were important not only because they provided her with social interaction, but also because they helped her realize that she was not alone in her struggles. The other children, many of whom were also blind or deaf, showed Helen that there were others who had faced similar challenges and had found ways to live fulfilling lives. This sense of community and shared experience was invaluable to Helen, giving her a new sense of belonging and purpose. During this time, Helen also began to develop a deeper understanding of her place in the world. She learned about the struggles of others who were marginalized or oppressed and began to see her own challenges in a broader context. She became deeply interested in social justice and human rights, concepts that would later shape much of her activism and public work. Helen's journey into language and communication had taken her from isolation and frustration to a place of intellectual curiosity and emotional connection. She was no longer the child trapped in darkness and silence. Through the dedication of Anne Sullivan and her own incredible determination, Helen had unlocked the power of language, opening the door to a world of possibilities. Chapter 4. Expanding Horizons, College and Writing. By the time Helen Keller was a teenager, she had accomplished more than many people with all their senses intact, but her ambitions were far from satisfied. She wanted to attend college, something that had been unheard of for someone with her disabilities at the time. Helen's desire for higher education was fueled by her love of learning, and she believed that college would provide her with the intellectual stimulation she craved. However, the path to college was not an easy one. Helen faced enormous challenges, not only in terms of her disabilities, but also in overcoming societal expectations. People with disabilities were often viewed as incapable of academic achievement, and many institutions were not equipped to accommodate students like Helen. But she was determined to prove that she could succeed in a world that had not been designed for her. In 1896, at the age of 16, Helen was accepted to the Cambridge School for Young Ladies, a preparatory school for Radcliffe College, the sister school of Harvard University. Attending Cambridge was a major milestone for Helen, but it came with its own set of difficulties. The school had no resources for teaching students who were both blind and deaf, so Anne Sullivan had to accompany Helen to all of her classes. Anne sat beside Helen, manually spelling out the lectures into her hand as they were being delivered. This method was both exhausting and inefficient, but it was the only way for Helen to keep up with her studies. Despite these challenges, Helen thrived at Cambridge. Her determination to succeed, coupled with her incredible work ethic, impressed both her teachers and her classmates. She was known for her sharp intellect, her curiosity, and her ability to grasp complex concepts quickly. However, the physical and emotional toll of her studies began to weigh heavily on both Helen and Anne. The constant pressure of keeping up with her classmates, combined with the difficulties of communication, made the experience incredibly taxing. After 2 years at Cambridge, Helen was accepted to Radcliffe College, making her the first deaf-blind person to attend an institution of higher learning. This achievement was nothing short of extraordinary. Radcliffe, like most universities at the time, had no accommodations for students with disabilities, so Helen continued to rely on Anne to interpret lectures and textbooks. Anne's tireless dedication to Helen's education became even more evident during this time, as she spent countless hours reading aloud, spelling into Helen's hand, and assisting her with her studies. At Radcliffe, Helen was introduced to a wide range of subjects, including literature, philosophy, history, and science. She was particularly drawn to literature, finding in it a way to connect with the broader human experience. Books became a refuge for Helen, allowing her to explore new ideas, cultures, and perspectives that she had never encountered before. She also began to write not only as a means of self-expression, but also as a way to share her experiences and thoughts with others. In 1903, Helen published her first autobiography, The Story of My Life, which she had written while still a student at Radcliffe. The book was an immediate success, offering readers an intimate look at her early life, her struggles with blindness and deafness, and her extraordinary relationship with Anne Sullivan. Helen's writing was praised for its clarity, emotional depth, and eloquence. The Story of My Life became a bestseller, and it remains one of the most widely read autobiographies of all time. Writing became an essential part of Helen's life, providing her with a platform to express her ideas and advocate for social change. Over the course of her career, she would go on to write multiple books and articles covering a wide range of topics, including disability rights, social justice, and women's suffrage. Her writing, like her life, was characterized by a deep sense of empathy and a passion for improving the lives of others. Graduating from Radcliffe in 1904, Helen Keller became one of the most famous women in the world. Her achievement was not only a personal triumph, but also a powerful symbol of what people with disabilities could accomplish if given the opportunity. Helen had not only shattered societal expectations, but had also opened the door for future generations of disabled individuals to pursue higher education and intellectual fulfillment. Chapter 5. Becoming an advocate and a voice for the disabled. Following her graduation from Radcliffe, Helen Keller's life took on a new direction. No longer just a student or a figure of curiosity, she began to actively use her platform to advocate for the rights of disabled individuals and for broader social causes. Her fame, which had grown with the success of her autobiography, provided her with the opportunity to reach large audiences and influence public opinion. One of Helen's primary areas of focus was advocating for the rights of people with disabilities. In the early 20th century, disabled individuals were often marginalized, stigmatized, and excluded from many aspects of society. Schools and workplaces were rarely equipped to accommodate them, and there were few laws protecting their rights. Helen, having experienced firsthand the challenges of living with disabilities, was determined to change this. Helen became involved with several organizations that worked to improve the lives of the blind and deaf, including the American Foundation for the Blind, where she served as a spokesperson and advocate for much of her adult life. Through her work with the AFB, Helen lobbied for laws to improve education and job opportunities for blind and deaf individuals. She believed that people with disabilities had the potential to contribute to society in meaningful ways, and she worked tirelessly to remove the barriers that stood in their way. One of Helen's most significant accomplishments was her role in advocating for the establishment of government-funded services for the blind, including vocational training programs that would help them find employment. She also fought for Braille literacy, believing that access to education through Braille was critical to the independence and empowerment of blind individuals. Helen's advocacy work went beyond disability rights. She was deeply concerned with social justice issues, and her views on politics, labor rights, and women's suffrage often placed her at odds with the mainstream. A committed socialist, Helen believed that the inequalities she saw in society were a result of a flawed economic system. She was vocal about her support for workers' rights, advocating for better wages, safer working conditions, and the right to unionize. Her alignment with the socialist movement led to criticism from some quarters, but Helen was undeterred. She saw her activism as a moral imperative, driven by her belief that all people, regardless of their abilities or social status, deserve dignity and the opportunity to lead fulfilling lives. Helen also became a prominent advocate for women's rights, supporting the suffrage movement and championing equal opportunities for women in education and the workforce. She saw the struggles of women, particularly those from marginalized communities, as deeply connected to the broader fight for justice and equality. Her advocacy on behalf of women and the working class earned her respect from many progressive activists of her time, though it also made her a controversial figure in some circles. Despite the challenges she faced, Helen's determination to use her voice for the greater good never wavered. She was invited to speak at events across the country and around the world, where she addressed audiences on topics ranging from disability rights to social justice. Helen's speeches, often delivered with the assistance of an interpreter, were known for their eloquence and passion. She used these opportunities to challenge societal norms and inspire others to work for change. Anne Sullivan, who had been by Helen's side through every step of her journey, continued to support her during this period of intense activism. Anne's health, however, began to decline as she aged, and the strain of years of teaching and traveling with Helen took a toll on her physically. Despite her own health challenges, Anne remained dedicated to Helen, accompanying her to public engagements and continuing to assist her in her daily life. The bond between the two women was as strong as ever, a testament to the deep connection they had formed through years of shared struggle and triumph. In 1936, Anne Sullivan passed away, leaving Helen devastated. Anne had been more than just a teacher. She had been a mentor, a friend, and a constant source of support throughout Helen's life. Without Anne, Helen felt an immense void, but she knew that Anne would want her to continue her work. In the years following Anne's death, Helen continued to advocate for the causes she cared about, carrying on the legacy of the woman who had helped her unlock the world.